welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I'm doing a review for Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. This is my second time filming this review. The first time it was way too long and I couldn't edit it down in a way that would be cohesive, so I'm trying again, but I have a lot to say about this book. It is a very long book with a lot of stuff going on, and I have a lot of thoughts and opinions, so I'm going to try and make this as concise as I can, but it is probably still going to end up being longer than my reviews usually are. But let's just get started. So Kushiel's Dart is an adult alternate history fantasy. It's relatively low on the actual fantastical or magical elements, and most of the actual magic in this world comes from the gods and the religion. This is set in kind of an alternate history Europe, and the primary country that we're in is called D'Angeline, which is kind of like France, although we do visit other countries as well throughout the book. Now, one of the alternate history elements of this that's very important to the story is the religion. And the premise of this religion is kind of like, what if Jesus had a son who started his own religion and that became the most prominent religion? So in this world, they have the one God who had a son that is called Yeshua, which is actually the Hebrew name for Jesus. So they have Jesus, and when Yeshua dies on the cross, his blood and the tears of a kind of Mary Magdalene character mix with the earth, and from that comes this other god called Elua. So it's kind of like another Immaculate Conception in a way. And Elua is unacknowledged by the one God, and so he travels the earth with a group of fallen angels, spreading his own gospel, which is love as thou wilt. Now, as they are traveling, they can't always support themselves, and so one of these angels that travels with Elua, named Naama, she becomes a prostitute as a way of supporting Elua and the other angels. And so in this religion, sex and sex work is kind of holy in a way and is seen as a way of worshiping God. And eventually these angels that Elua is traveling with kind of become like gods themselves, and there are people who are dedicated to specific gods like Naama or Kushiel. In this world also, because of this new religion kind of rising to prominence, Christianity and Judaism, or what would have kind of stood in for those in this alternate history, never split from one another and stayed as one religion, which are called the Yeshuites because they follow Yeshua, not Elua. Now, our main character in this is Phaedra, who is an indentured servant, and her mark has been bought by a nobleman named Delani. Her mark is kind of like her contract for being an indentured servant, so eventually she will be able to work or buy her way out of it. And from a young age, she is trained as both a courtesan and a spy, and so she is able to have access to different places and people through her courtesan work that allows her to spy on them for Delani. As a courtesan, Phaedra is dedicated to the goddess Naama, but she's also been chosen by Kushiel. Kushiel is the god of punishment, and those who worship Kushiel or are chosen by him usually practice BDSM. Now, for Phaedra, because she has been chosen by Kushiel and pierced by Kushiel's dart, which can be seen by other people because she has a red mote in one of her eyes, it means that she experiences pleasure and pain as one experience, and so she also practices BDSM as part of her courtesan work. Now, the simple version of the plot of this story is pretty much that through her spying, Phaedra finds out about a conspiracy among the nobles, and then she tries to stop it. But that's a very simplified version. So overall, I ended up both really enjoying and having a lot of complaints about this book. I had some very mixed feelings about it, which I'm going to talk about, but I wanted to say right off the bat that I did really end up enjoying it, even though a lot of this review is just going to be me complaining about it. But before diving into the more reviewy part of this, I did want to talk quickly about two things that I think are kind of misconceptions about this book or series from what I have read of it. Obviously, I've only read the first book, but from having read the first one, I feel like these are misconceptions that at least I encountered before reading it. The first thing that I found to be a misconception about this book was the comparison to Juliet Marillier's books, specifically her Seven Water series. I frequently see these two books either compared or in one of those if you like this, try this kind of recommendations. And while I did enjoy both series, so there may be some merit to those recommendations, overall, I don't think there's really anything in common between them. The most that these two books have in common is that they're both adult historical fantasy that are written by women around the same time, which was like in the early 2000s. And they're both very slow-paced first-person POV. But that's about it in terms of commonality between them. I think that in terms of story content, plot, setting, writing, atmosphere, the things that actually make the book, these two really don't have a lot in common. And so it's just not a really fair comparison, and I don't think you should go into one expecting it to be anything like the other. The second misconception that I encountered was that this book is pretty much just erotica, which I don't think is true. Now, there's nothing wrong with erotica, but I don't think that's an accurate representation of what this book is. Now, there is a lot of sexual content in this book. It is throughout the story, especially since it is set in this world with this religion and culture that sees sex and sex work as holy. And on top of that, our main character, Phaedra, is a courtesan, and so this is her life and her work and her training, and, you know, is one of her greatest tools to accomplish what she needs to accomplish. And so yes, there's a lot of sexual content in the book, but I definitely would not consider this to be primarily erotica. I don't think that was the focus of the story. From my reading of the story, I really felt like the focus of this book was primarily on the world building and the politics, because the politics in particular, I think, really take center stage and do get kind of complicated and confusing at times, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I really felt like the world building and politics were the focus of the story. So those are just two things that I thought were misconceptions from my reading experience of this first book. But since we're already here talking about the sexual content of the book, I just have a couple more things to say, because you do have to be prepared for it, because there is quite a bit in the book, and a lot of it is BDSM, and it can get fairly graphic and does involve things like bondage, beating, cutting, burning, humiliation. There is a safe word and a contract that patrons have to sign before seeing Phaedra. However, a lot of times there's very little communication between the people involved, and patrons frequently go too far and go beyond what was agreed upon in the contract. So just be aware of that in terms of the way that BDSM is depicted in this. Also, content warning for sexual assault. And then another thing that can be upsetting in this book is just how young Phaedra is throughout the story, because she pretty much grows up in a brothel, and then at about age 10 she starts being trained as a courtesan, and at that point it is mostly like theoretical training, so she's not actually having sex with anybody, but that is still much too young to be receiving that type of training. And then she starts seeing patrons and actually sleeping with people at about 16, which is also very, very young. And so that is something that, while it makes sense for the world in which this is set, was uncomfortable to read about. Okay, so we're finished with talking about the sex in the book. We're gonna move on to pacing. The pacing of this book is so slow, and in addition to being very slowly paced, the structure of the story felt like it could almost be 3 different books. There are 2 points in the story that I felt would have been a natural break for the story, and each of the sections that it creates felt very different from one another and felt like they could have been their own book practically. But the first 40% or so of the book is mostly really focused on the world building, Phaedra's training, and the politics. And the politics definitely can get confusing. She really doesn't hold your hand. I found it really helpful to buddy read this book. I buddy read it with Chris from Bookish, Cauldron and Anita from Anita Reads, and that was really helpful to have people to be like, do you understand what's going on? Who is this person? Why did they do this? And I don't know if I would have really understood what was happening or been able to push through without having people to to talk to about this, so it was really helpful to buddy read it. Now, for me, I think there were primarily two reasons why I found it difficult to follow the politics in this book. The first one is because the story is being told through Phaedra's perspective in first-person, single point of view, meaning that if Phaedra hasn't directly interacted with somebody, neither have we. And so it starts to feel like there are a lot of names being thrown around who I don't necessarily know who they are because I don't have any interactions to anchor these names and politics on. The second reason that I found it kind of difficult to follow the politics was because the stakes and the goals are unclear for a large portion of the story. Now, that's because Phaedra's just following Delanie's orders. Delanie is the nobleman who owns her mark and that she is working for. And he has his own, like, political reasons and schemes going on, which he doesn't tell Phaedra, mostly because he's trying to protect her, because the less she knows, the safer she is. But that means that also we don't know what the stakes are or what the goals are. And so it can make it difficult to kind of filter information, because as we're gaining all of this information about characters and politics, I didn't know what was relevant or important and what I should hang on to. So it just felt like the information was kind of overwhelming. It also kind of made it hard to care about the politics, just because I didn't really understand why we were doing any of this and what the stakes were, so it was harder to be like emotionally invested in the goal. Now, after that first 40-ish% of the story, the main plot and goals do become clear. And so in that next section, I started to be more invested in the story. Also because in this section, I think the characters start to more actively make choices. We get to know the characters better. Also, some of Phaedra's other training starts to come in handy, because in addition to being trained as a courtesan, she also is trained in things like map making and languages and acrobatics and all kinds of other things. And those things start to come in handy, and it's cool to see her like use some of those other skills. So this middle section of the story was really my favorite part. The stakes felt the highest. I felt the most invested. The stakes also felt the most like immediate. And that's the part that really like sold me on the book. And then the last section of the book, once again, felt very different from the first two in tone. It really became, I think, grander in scale and almost felt like a mythical quest in a way. But one thing I didn't really like about the last section was that it started to feel like Phaedra could either get anything she wanted or fix any problem just by having sex with somebody. For most of the book, that wasn't the case. It didn't feel like that, but just towards the end, like, people started either giving her whatever she wanted or making like military decisions and battle decisions based on just wanting to have sex with her. And it was kind of ridiculous, and that got really frustrating just at the end. Now, as for the characters, I ended up really liking Phaedra as a character. She's very clever and determined. She's really able to read people, and she's really a survivor who like will survive by any means necessary, and I liked that a lot about her. She also is willing to take calculated risks, and for the most part they really do feel calculated and not reckless. There were maybe a few instances in which I think she made some reckless decisions that were kind of annoying, but overall they did feel like calculated decisions. Now, there's also Delanie, who is the nobleman with a mysterious past who owns her mark, and he also is really a mentor and almost father figure to her, and she's very devoted to him. She also has two childhood friends. One of them is Alcuin, who is also being trained as a courtesan alongside Phaedra, and he's a very gentle character, and Hyacinth, who is a commoner who lives in the city, and he has his own, like, network of informants throughout the city. And then the last character I want to mention is Jocelyn, who becomes her bodyguard, and he is part of a warrior priesthood, and he has vows to serve and protect. He's very honor bound but also kind of self-righteous. Now, I ended up enjoying all of these characters, but I definitely also felt a distance from all of the characters, and there was a point in the story where I realized that if any one of them died, I wouldn't really care that much. And I think that there are a few reasons why I felt a distance from the characters. One of them is, I think, because the author kind of steers away from the more emotional moments or those character moments, which are usually my favorite part of the story because I'm a character-focused reader. But you can very clearly feel where her focus and attention and energy was going in the story, which was much more focused on the world building and the politics, and not as focused on those like little character emotional moments. I also think a lot of the distance for me came from the framing of the storytelling. The story is being told in hindsight by Phaedra, so Phaedra is kind of telling us her life story, and that's a setup that's just not a favorite of mine in general, but also that causes her to kind of summarize events or interactions so they don't feel as immediate, and there is that feeling of distance. Also, as a narrator, Phaedra inserts herself into the narration a lot, and she'll say a lot of things like, if only I had known that this wasn't going to work out, or if only I had known that like our plan was going to fail. Or she'll do things where she'll give you a piece of information about a character and then be like, but I wouldn't find that out for another 10 years. And that it got really annoying. It doesn't always bother me when authors do things like that, but it just happened so frequently that it started to get really annoying, but it also creates this feeling of distance, because instead of feeling like you are experiencing the story with the character, it becomes very obvious that there is a narrator telling you the story and making the story feel more distant from you. So as much as I did like these characters, I didn't feel particularly emotionally connected to them. And that was also the case with the romance in the story, because there is eventually a romance that starts to take place between two of the characters, and it is a very slow burn romance, and it's kind of hate to love, and there are definitely elements about it that I really enjoyed, but there was still quite a feeling of distance from that romance, and I wasn't as emotionally invested in it as I would have liked to be. But I did really like the writing itself. The writing is very lovely, it really flows, and it is atmospheric, and I think that's one of the things that really carried me through the story, because otherwise I think I would have gotten really bogged down in the book, because the politics and the world building do get pretty dense, but the writing itself, while it is very beautifully written and very lovely, it doesn't feel dense, and I think is very readable, and which is really nice for such a long book. So I really loved the writing in this, and I want to read other books from this author to see what her writing is like in other contexts. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on is the Yeshuites. So I mentioned at the beginning that the Yeshuites are the people who still follow Yeshua, who is the Jesus figure of this world. But because Judaism and Christianity didn't split from one another in this alternate history, they kind of become a combination of Judaism and Christianity. They have a lot of markers of being Jewish and speak kind of a pseudo-Hebrew language, but they believe in Yeshua as the Messiah / God. So Christianity also. And personally, I didn't really like that these two were combined. I understand that it's an alternate history and why it was done for the sake of this world and everything, but it gets kind of weird when you're talking about real world religions that have their own history and problems with this kind of thing, especially when in the real world there's already people acting like Judaism and Christianity are interchangeable, or Judaism is just Christianity minus the Jesus, when that is not the case. They are distinct, and there's a reason that these two religions split from one another because of fundamental differences between the two of them. Now, this isn't something that prevented me from enjoying the book or would prevent me from continuing on in the series, but it is something that made me a little uncomfortable and I just was not a fan of. Also, this might be a little more nitpicky, but there's a point in the story where the characters encounter a Yeshuite family and they greet them in the Yeshuite language, which is kind of a pseudo-Hebrew language. And the way they greet them is pretty much by saying Baruch atah Adonai, which is the beginning of a bracha, not a greeting. So a bracha is a type of blessing that you say most often over food. It's pretty much like thanking God for something. So usually you say it over food to thank God for your food. But it's not a greeting. And it just was like one of those moments where I'm like, really? You couldn't just look up what a Hebrew greeting would be instead of using a bracha? Anyway, so that was just like a little, might be more nitpicky, but it was a little frustration that annoyed me. Anyway, as I said, those are not things that would prevent me from continuing on in the series, because I do intend to continue reading this series. Overall, this book was kind of an exhausting read, but I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I'm planning to read at least the next book, if not the rest of this trilogy. So that is all for my review of Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. If you have read this book, I would love to chat with you in the comments and hear what you think of it. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!